What could we learn from somebody who has been faithfully in ministry for 6+ decades? What are some of the biggest issues facing the church today? And in our cultural moment, how can we effectively reach people for Christ? Well, we're glad you're with us because here on the Think Biblically podcast, brought to you by Biola University, we have a special episode tonight. And it's special in one sense because we're celebrating our 5th year as a podcast, which is pretty amazing to think about, Scott. But it's also kind of special because we brought back our first guest, didn't we?
We going full circle. I remember after we interviewed Josh for the first time, for the very first episode, he said, if your ratings fall off, then call me back. And we just, 5 years later, we called him back.
There you go.
And our ratings have not fallen off one bit, but I'm sure we're going to go now to 110,000 downloads a month by virtue of having you on with us.
Or you'll go to 90.
That's a possibility too.
Yeah, we feel like we're returning the favor now.
Yeah, you're here.
Flip the script. But Dad, we're honored that you're with us. And my first question is, it was fun to put this together, watching your ministry, but also just seeing you as your son. And I thought about, you've been doing ministry 60+ years. You've had 100, 200 debates, 100 and some books, done humanitarian aid projects. You've spoken to over 1,200 universities to more people live than anyone in history. I'd love to hear over this time just one or two stories or experiences that just rise to the top. One of your favorite, one of the most significant, maybe it was the debate with Didat, maybe it's humanitarian aid. I don't want to put things in your mouth, but the kinds of opportunities, now looking back, you'd say that was just significant, and I'm honored and amazed God used me to do that.
I would say one of the, not just significant, but impactful was when, I got a lot of criticism for it at that time, when I launched the Why Wait campaign. And it was revolutionary because at that time, you just didn't talk about sex publicly, especially in the church or a church camp, whatever. And I remember youth pastors say, I don't know what's going to happen. They knew how the kids were going to respond. It was the parents they were worried about. And so I said, I think the launching of the Why Wait campaign, which went global, was one of the most significant contributions the Lord allowed us in our ministry to do. And then probably the second greatest thing was asking your mother to marry me. And I'm dead serious on that. She is so wise. Well, you know that. She is so wise, so insightful. And she tempered me. She caused me to be more relational. Through her, I learned to relax more when I talked about love and relationships and sex and all. And I don't think the Lord would give me the impact that He's allowed me to have if I'd married a woman not quite like your mom. And every day I just pinch myself that I'm married to that woman. I mean, it's I never thought it could happen that for 50-some years you could remain so in love and respect. I think the key is respect even more than love, that you could so respect each other over the years.
Josh, one of the things I've appreciated about your ministry over all these years is how you've talked about how you've learned, how you continue to learn and to read and to study, and how you've grown over the years, and how have matured in your approach to communication and to ministry. If you were starting over today as a 25-year-old and as a communicator, what would you do differently today than you did when you first started out?
It probably wouldn't be easy for me to answer because back when I was 23, 24, 25, I wanted to go into law. That was my heartbeat. And God called me out of it to Talbot Seminary. And I remember making a choice, I don't know what you would call it, that I wanted to live my life have a ministry that when I'm 50, 60, 70 years old, there's nothing I'd want to do different. Because everyone I listen to, if I had to do it over again, I would do this and I would do that and everything. That's all I heard when I was in seminary at Talbot right here. And so I decided I'm going to try to live my life without regrets. And so I can't think of too much. Right now, I can't think of anything I would do differently, especially the results of it. So I'm going to back away from that question. I couldn't tell you what I would do differently.
Okay, fair enough, because I think that's that's a significant part of that goal, to live life without regrets, and to be thoughtful, think through how you're going to do things, and not have regrets looking back. I commend you for that.
Wow.
People will sometimes use the word prophetic when talking about you. They'll say, well, Josh is a prophet. And I've heard you say many times, you'll say, I'm not a prophet. I just study and look at culture and try to see trends. So when it came to sexuality, you were ahead of the curve in the church. When it came to tolerance in the 90s, ahead of the curve in the church. As you look at trends right now, I know things are changing more quickly than they maybe did in the past.
Because of the cell phone.
Because of the smartphone information. What trends do you see that are here that concern you, or some that are maybe coming down the road, so to speak, that we should have on our radar?
I believe in the next 8, 10, 12 years, you're going to see the church as a whole, gosh, I hate to say this, move away from objectivity to more subjectivity, that which is relevant at the time. And I say that because as I read people and pastors, I listen to a lot of people talk, that's how I catch the trend going. And I don't think it's a healthy trend, but a lot of people go too much over in the objective. And I've learned one principle that's true in life. Balance is almost always biblical. And if it's biblical, it's balanced. It really is. It's not to the extremes. It's the balance in life. And I think that's key in ministry.
Can I follow up on that just for a moment?
Yeah,
just
go ahead.
to unpack that a little bit further. What are some examples that cause you to see this shift away from objective truth to truth being more subjective in the church today?
I think it's been rather easy. I read all the time. I listen. I feel I've wasted an hour if I go jogging and I'm not listening. And
We have a great podcast you could be listening to.
yeah, that's very objective. But as I've listened to the different speakers, everything, the programs, it's just gradually shifting away from that which is true objectively. And I think when that happens, it's very easy for an individual, a church, or a group to get away from the gospel. The gospel is very objective. Yeah. I think some of the areas where we need to be key on the evidence, and evidence always points to objectivity, is the resurrection, the deity of Christ, the prophecies fulfilled in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. I believe more today, schools like Biola, Talbot, Moody, etc., they really need to make sure they've got the objectivity in their teachings, what it goes back to. The resurrection was an event in history. In 3 days, that tomb was empty. Yeah. But have the evidence for it. Have the evidence for it.
All right. This question is related to being married 51 years. You referenced earlier how significant it is to be married to
Dottie.
my mom. But what does it take, especially from a broken home and not having an example, to stay married and faithful to somebody half a century plus? When the culture is saying subjectivity, do whatever feels good, etc.
Plagiarize. There's probably no one in life.
Spell that out just a little bit,
There's
would
probably
you?
no one in life that has plagiarized more than I have. I literally had a discussion with myself on that years ago. And when I go to church, Christian conferences, seminars, at church, for example, I would watch the pastor, how he related to his wife, his children. I'd watch the businessmen there, couples, families. In fact, I remember going out in the foyer, and I would get close to people to listen to their conversations, how a man talked to his wife and everything. And I think that significantly helped me.
Let me follow up on the marriage part, if I might. You spent a lot of your ministry years on the road, traveled,
All my ministry years I spent on the road.
I just from what Sean described your schedule just to make it here, you haven't slowed down hardly at all. How have you been able to keep your marriage together so successfully while being on the road so much of your professional life?
Well, probably the basic principle, I got to say this right because people misunderstand it. Never, never, ever put your ministry before, never put your marriage or ministry before your marriage. Never. And what I've learned, I never wanted to put my ministry before my marriage because my marriage is my first ministry. And so what I do with Campus Crusade, everything else, all the speaking, my entire life has been secondary. But of course, I'm married to the most fantastic woman.
Amen.
I mean, I really am. It's just I'm humbled. I pinch myself that for 51 years I've been married to Dottie. And so it's easy to not put the ministry before my marriage.
Let me ask you another question that's, again, a little bit more on the personal side, if I might. Over the last decade or so, we've seen so many public Christian leaders fall from grace. And they've had, it's been for a variety of different reasons.
It hurts, doesn't it?
It does. It's very painful to think about. But I think what I'm encouraged about is that your name is not on the list of people who have fallen. How do you account for that over the 60 plus years of ministry, and I'm sure countless opportunities to fall from grace? But how have you remained faithful to your message, to your ministry, and to your marriage?
God has called me first to be married to Dottie before he's called me into the ministry. So for me, one, it's a priority relationship. Second, I really want, and a lot of times I've failed, my life and ministry to coincide with God's desires. And I know my love for Dottie and everything is right in the center of God's desires for me, even more than ministry. Because if Dottie and I lost our marriage and our love and everything for each other, my ministry would be gone. It would be. But that's not why I love her. But it's priority. And then never, ever quit working on your marriage. Never stop. I always think of new ways I can tell Dottie I love her, everything else. And so always work on your marriage. Learn from others, watch others, reading the books. I still read books on marriage. Not a lot now, but every once in a while I hear a book, people are saying, boy, that's a great book and everything. And I thought they were talking about one of mine, and I found out they weren't. And so I would get that book and read it. Yeah.
Very good.
The other, I can't mention this one because Scotty said, Don't you talk
Don't
about...
do it, Dad.
I'm not going
Let
to.
me just stop you right there.
I can't do it, but you can imagine
next
what it
question
is.
here, really quickly. Go for it.
You know, perhaps the most famous Biola graduation speech of all time, 1998, my senior year. You were speaking. You told me I'd be surprised, but I didn't expect this level of surprise.
And as a faculty member sitting through it,
You were
it
there
was
as a faculty
awesome.
member.
Were you there?
I was. It was
before I-
You
fabulous.
still remember every word of it, don't you?
I do.
Do you really remember word for word? I've never
One
asked you
sentence.
this. Let's go. You said you heard it. What is it?
You're never, ever, ever stop loving God and loving your spouse.
Yep. I left out
He
the
said
God.
it 3 times.
I left out the God part, but everything else was right along with it.
I felt like
it
that
sounded
was,
better
I
the
felt
way
like
you
that was
said
kind
it.
of important.
So
Yeah,
that
it sounded a
was-
lot better the way you say it. More spiritual, godly
close enough.
man.
So that was pretty good. And I remember because I've had people quote this to me. Never stop pursuing an intimate, loving relationship with your spouse and spend time with your kids.
I
Said
repeated it three
times and sat down, and I was surprised. And Clyde Cook was the president, and he goes, well, I'm glad we're paying Josh by the word.
I don't even think they gave me an honorarium after that one.
Well, yeah.
But it's been
Well,
quoted more than any speech in the history of Biola.
Oh, it's the most memorable graduation I've ever been to.
I had a friend at
My own
BYU,
included.
a high school friend at BYU. His wife goes, hey, was this you who gave this speech? And she recited. I was like, no, that's my dad at my graduation. She remembered it. But I'm bringing that up because you said one of the ways you stayed faithful is to love your wife, my mom, and you spent time with us as kids. You did
I
that.
had people come up to me and say, that was horrible. You're just lazy, aren't you? I said, well, I just gave the speech. It's going to be quoted more than any other speech over there. But I said, I spent about $800 on that talk. And I tried to find out what is the one thing that's going to derail their ministry, their life, and their marriage. And I found out the thing that would derail their ministry and everything is their marriage. So that's when I came up with never, ever, ever, ever stop pursuing a loving, intimate relationship with your wife, repeated it 3 times and sat down. And I got the point across. Because that's the number one thing that's derailing people. Yeah.
All the faculty were cheering you on.
Yep.
Yeah, they wanted to go out for dinner.
Great. That's right.
In part for
But it
being
was-
short, everyone was looking around like, that was awesome. Your dad killed
That's
it.
right.
I was like, I know, he did. Hey, Dad, a question for you. You study the next generation. Gen Zers are now probably around junior high, maybe 12 and up to like 25. So the early name right now is Gen Alpha. There'll probably be a new name in due time. I've only really seen a couple handful of
Gen Beta.
studies. Yeah, it could be. I've only seen a few studies about this generation because it's hard to ask 8-year-olds what they think about things. But do you have any sense of some of the unique traits, unique characteristics, unique challenges that this generation, say those who are like 1 to 11 right now, might face? What might be unique about them? For example, I know one thing they'll be is the first majority non-white generation. Gen Z was the last. That's a factor. How digital they will be, et cetera. But do you have any thoughts on Gen Alpha?
Yes. I've already stated some of it tonight. I think you will find them more subjective than any other generation. That's the context they're growing up in. That's the emphasis of many parents and everything without them realizing it. And I would bet everything I had that they'll become a lot more subjective. Then I believe you're going to see not a rebellion, what would you call it? A reaction. And it's going to start shifting. I really do. A lot of it would depend upon the church.
When
and
you
our
say
pastors.
subjective, do you mean feeling-oriented, self-focused, because they've been told it's all about you, in a sense? Tell me
It's-
what you mean by that.
Feelings.
Okay.
It become more, I feel that's true. I feel that I feel this. And we're definitely going to be going there. I have no question about that. But I'm not sure how long it'll last because it'll fail. It will fail. And people will be miserable. And if the church, I think it all comes back to the church. I really do. And if the church produces healthy marriages, healthy families, it can be one of the greatest things that could happen in America. And I think we would see, actually, I think you could almost call it a nationwide revival if the church does its job. And I got a lot of confidence in the church.
Let me pursue that a little bit further. You've talked about some things that you're worried about the church going forward. What are some things that encourage you about what the church is doing? And what gives you hope for the future of the church from where you sit today? Was that a 3-star question that you indicated?
That was heavy breathing questions. It's kind of difficult for me to answer that one because I don't like saying anything unless I'm got pretty good convictions about it and can back it up. And right now, I don't know if I could back it up, but I believe because the church is here to stay. And I think you look at history, I don't know how many times the church has rebounded. They really have. I'm proud of the church. I'm proud of the pastors that we have. And I really think it'll be repeated that the church is going to rebound and take the country with it. I really do. Because God is in control. Yeah. But America will probably pass away as not the most powerful nation right away, but the most influential nation, I think, will start changing. I really do. And there's several reasons for that. One is America's had a lot of influence over the years for one reason, all the movies. I mean, about 95, 97% of all the movies in the world come out of Hollywood, America, American culture, American everything. Tremendous influence. And then television. But now, I think what's going to cause a shift is one of the most powerful items of technology ever, the smartphone. I think more and more people from other countries, other cultures, that now they can transmit their culture. They can transmit their ideas where they couldn't before. And I think there's some great cultures out there. I mean, I think America's a great culture, but there's some great cultures out there that are going to rise to the top. And my only hope is that they'll have a positive influence in the world with that. I hope so.
Yeah, I think just to be clear, we're not equating the flourishing of any particular country with the progress of the kingdom of God. Those are two completely separate things. And I know you're not
I sure hope
that.
they are.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And as much as we want America to continue to flourish,
I'm not talking about flourishing just spiritually. I'm talking about financially,
right.
Political influence, military, everything.
Culture.
Yeah. And because of this smartphone, more and more people are exposed to other cultures and the good in other cultures. Right. And that's going to rise to the forefront. It really will. It already is. It already is. Yeah.
Dad, I got one last question for you. And it's possible you answered this, but you could reiterate it. We've got a lot of students here at Biola that not only listen to the podcast, students at Talbot, grad students that do, but some here in person listening while we record this. What encouragement would you give to a young person today? Just to be faithful, to live a life of influence in light of this cultural moment. What encouragement would you give to a young person who says, hey man, you've been doing this a long time. Give me some words of wisdom.
The number one thing I would say, because it's the number one thing I do say, is no matter what kind of relationship you have with your mom and dad, do everything within your power to develop a healthy relationship with your mom and dad. Because if you do, you will never, ever regret it. But if you don't, you will probably grow up regretting it. I wish I would have done more. I wish I would have done this, whatever. Because I'm convinced, I think I can prove it statistically and in research, that the healthier relationship you have in your parents, the healthier your life is going to be when you live it out. It really is. I wish more parents took more seriously the impact they have upon children. But I mean, my dad was drunk all the time. My mother, I think, drove him to drink. My mother weighed 346 pounds, and she was only 5'9", and so she could throw my dad around. I remember in the kitchen throwing him against the wall, everything. And I think my mother humiliated my dad and drove him to drink. Mm-hmm. But my mother was a good woman, but she sure had her negative parts. And so the better the relationship of a child with their parents, the healthier their life is going to be and the greater the impact. And you got to remember, parents are not perfect. Some of them are not even clear to being perfect. But they're still the parents that God chose for you. And I would do everything I could to have a good relationship with my mom and dad.
Appreciate your vulnerability on that. That's rich. Thank you.
Well, I wish to God every day I'd had a loving, close, meaningful, intimate relationship with my mom and dad. And I didn't. And I don't think a day goes by I don't think about it. And I mean, my one brother sued my parents for everything they had. Took everything, and he probably deserved it. But my other sister ran away from home. My other sister killed herself. And my other brother left, and I still don't know where he is. He's 2 years older than me, and I have no idea. I've gone on the internet and everything trying to find him, and I can't. It wasn't a very healthy family. But where I was fortunate, I had a Dick Day in my life, and I married the right woman. I married the right woman. If I had married anyone that wasn't quite like Dottie, I wouldn't be married right now. I'd be divorced. And I wouldn't, I mean, God has allowed me to have a global ministry and impact in people's lives. And I couldn't have had that without being married to someone like Dottie. And I love it. Her kids call her my shining star.
Here.
Yeah. I call her my boss. No, I don't. No, I don't. It's just, I always do what she says because she makes so much sense.
There you go.
It bugs me sometimes.
Well, I had some
You
more.
said that was the last question.
I did. I was about to say I had some more questions for you, but that felt like a mic drop moment. You brought a full circle back to mom, full circle back to the impact Dick Day had on your life. So, Dad, thanks for coming back. We'll have you in 5 more years. We'll do it again.
Where do I pick up the check?
We'll just keep
I've learned
going.
one thing. If I leave, when you leave without a check, the longer it takes to get to you, the smaller it is.
Josh, this was called Singing for Your Supper tonight.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. I'll write that one up.
Cut his mic.
That's
Cut
my
his mic.
10% for this year.
That's it.
All right, Dad, thanks.
I don't care what others say. You two are okay.
We appreciate that. Well, you can hear the applause in the background. Thanks, Dad. That was wonderful. If you want to hear more of his story, check out his book and video, Undaunted Tells His Life. I think you'll enjoy that. This has been brought to you by the Think Biblically podcast from Biola University Talbot School of Theology. Check out biola.edu/Think Biblically for more episodes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, or even if you didn't enjoy today's podcast, please give us a rating on your podcast app and consider sharing it with a friend. Thanks so much, and remember, think biblically about everything. That was a wrap. I think we got it.
I think we did.
I think we got it.
Very nice.
32 minutes. That was pretty much right in the lane.
Did you all enjoy that?
Man,
Here, here. That's
good.
pretty good stuff. You don't get a chance to be around somebody who's been that influential for that long, who is also that old. Amen.
Actually, I do. I get to hang out with them all the time.
But it's not for our students here and our friends. What an opportunity. Josh, thanks so much for being with us. It was so rich.
That was great, Dad. Could not have been better. Well done. So, and my mom is here too. In case any, stand up and just wave, Mom.
Here,
you got
here.
a lot of love on this one. The wave. If you've heard the phrase "behind every great man is a great woman," could not be more true in their marriage. So, love you both. Thanks for coming. We ready to transition to number 2?
We are ready. You guys ready for another round?
So
Good.
before you start with the recording, that is the number. If you text it up, and it's going to come to my phone. We've got a system set up, and so if you have questions for us, questions about the podcast, whatever, we'd love to do our best to tackle some of those. So that number will probably stay up there, and let's do round 2.
All right.
Let's do it.
What does it mean to think biblically about the most pressing issues of the day? What are some of the most challenging apologetic questions that our culture puts in front of us today? What do we say about the recent surveys that have been released about the state of the Bible and about the state of theology? We'll answer these questions and a few more in this conversation with Sean and me in this episode of Think Biblically, a podcast of Talbot School of Theology here at Biola University. Sean, let's start with this. Where does the Bible tell us to think biblically about the issues of the day? We take that as an assumption, but what are some of the key biblical texts that demand that we think biblically about the issues of the day, about the questions that our culture has for us in the church?
In one sense, it's like a drumbeat or a golden thread through all of the scriptures. Not only does the scripture model this, but it teaches it in the Old Testament. We see it in the New Testament. So, of course, we go back to the creation story. We have, obviously, the great commandment later on, but there's this cultural mandate as well that we see early on. We could unpack that. One of the favorite passages I just go to is Jesus talks about loving God with your heart and your soul and with your mind and with your strength. In other words, love God with everything. Well, how do we love God with everything? Well, first off, we got to recognize that God is the creator of everything. And there's a great Dutch philosopher and theologian and politician, Abraham Kuyper, who said, "There's not a square inch of creation out of which God does not cry out, 'It's mine.'" So if God's the creator of everything, he tells us to love him with everything. That's with our passions, but that's also with our mind. So how do we think Christianly about the different topics that we could work through? So, look in the Old Testament and you have God in Isaiah saying, "Come, let us reason together. Let's use our minds." So it always has been, and hopefully always will be, a part of the Christian task, not just to do evangelism and discipleship, but to think Christianly, or as our podcast says, think biblically about everything.
Yeah, and when the Bible says to love God with all your heart and all your soul, those are actually figures of speech to refer to the whole person.
That's right.
Your mind included. I think of texts like when Peter put it in 1 Peter 3, to always be ready to give a defense, an apologia, which we got our term apologetic, give a defense for the hope that's within you. Or Paul's goal in 2 Corinthians 10, when he said his goal of his ministry is to enable the culture that he's ministering and to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So I think there's ample biblical mandate for us to think biblically, to think clearly, and to think rationally. And that's not all there is to it.
Sure.
We have to be passionate about it. We have to love God with our emotions as well. But there's a significant place for the life of the mind in what it means to be a faithful follower of Christ.
And we also see in the history of the church, this is what Christians have done consistently, is think about the cultural challenges, the theological challenges, the political challenges of the day through the lens of their Christian faith. Now, our society doesn't love this. Our society, which is increasingly secular, would say it's fine to have religious convictions, but keep them in your church, keep them in your home. And the Bible runs right up against that. In fact, you can think of Deuteronomy 6:4. He quotes, love the Lord God with your heart, soul, mind, your strength. Talk about these with your kids when you lie down, when you get up, when you walk along the road. In other words, make God a natural part of the rhythm of life. Everything that you do is shaped by this. So our secular culture is going to push back and say no, but as Christians, we can't. We bring our faith to everything.
And I would suggest for our secular culture to say, it's fine to have your religious convictions, but keep them to yourself. That's the equivalent of saying you're the salt of the earth, but you got to stay in the shaker. And you can't go out and have an influence. Or put your light of the world, but keep it under a bushel basket.
Did you make up that salt shaker line yourself?
No, I wish I had.
I like that. That's
I'd like
pretty
to patent
good.
that.
Hey, let me ask you a question. Apply this in your field of expertise. There was the recent post-Dobbs decision coming around the time of the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, which is coming up actually in January of this year. You've been studying this, writing on this, debating on this for a long time. Where do you see the abortion issue headed?
I think the impact of the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs v. Mississippi was to essentially send the issue back to the states, which is what a lot of legal scholars have argued should have been done in 1973 when Roe v. Wade was passed, and what the Supreme Court actually did when they ruled on assisted suicide in the late 1990s. They said states can prohibit it, they can allow it, but it's up to the will of the voters in that particular state. And so you'll see things on the ballot, like our Proposition 1 that's on the ballot in California now, which will legalize abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy for virtually any reason and for any method, particularly of any method of partial birth abortions in the last few weeks of pregnancy. There are virtually no limits. And even if I were pro-choice, I would have huge reservations about voting for Proposition 1 in California. And a number of states have chosen to put various restrictions on abortion rights. Some, I think, will be scaled back a bit. But I think it will be left to the states. I think increasingly the task for those of us who hold to a pro-life view and to see this as part of our biblical convictions, we'll see, I think, a greater need to pay attention to the plight of pregnant women, especially poor pregnant women with unwanted pregnancies, who are feeling, I think, today and I think understandably feeling increasingly desperate. And this is where the community of God's people has to step in a really meaningful way. And we have got to put our money where our mouth is on the church. We can't simply say, well, this is a great day for the unborn, and ignore the pregnant women who are now in various stages of distress because they may live in a state where the right to end their pregnancy is more limited.
Now, you've been a big supporter, myself included, pregnancy resource centers. So you're not saying the church hasn't done this at least decently well.
I think there are hundreds and hundreds of crisis pregnancy centers around the country with free medical care and the equivalent of social workers to walk through a pregnancy with a person to enable a woman to put a baby up for adoption. I think it's important that we recognize that just because a woman's pregnant, it doesn't commit her to raising the child. There are lots of families. The demand for adoptable newborn children far, far, far exceeds the supply today. And part of the reason for that is the 900,000 or so perform annually in the U.S. every year. So I think that's where I think the focus of ministry is going to shift into more of an emphasis on how do we care for these women who I think we are obligated to care for and to take good care of them.
Fair enough. Good. So in other words, the pro-life movement must make an argument better than we ever have before. An apologetic, a defense, think Christianly, and care for the unborn. It's both. That's right. Essentially what we have to do. So This is pushed back to the states, but in many ways, I've said this, and I think you have as well, the abortion issue has just begun, right?
Right. So the argument's been pushed back to the states too. And it's been much more on a grassroots level.
You all right?
I'm getting choked up here.
Yeah. Nice. All right. Let Let me ask you another one. Let's shift to another ethical issue that you told me when I was taking a class from you, this back early 2000s, the MA Phil program. I asked you what's the toughest ethical issue to face. And you said it's end-of-life issues, euthanasia, assisted suicide. Where do you see issues of the legalization of assisted suicide heading?
I think in the short term, gradually gaining more and more momentum. And it's interesting how the argument in favor of assisted suicide has changed over the years. It used to be, when this first got started in the early 90s or so, late 80s, early 90s, the argument was all about mercy to a suffering patient.
Okay.
That argument you don't hear much anymore. And the reason for that is because the science of palliative care has gotten so much better today than it's ever been. And access to adequate pain control at the end of life has increased exponentially than when we began this discussion 25, 30 years ago. I've heard physicians tell me repeatedly that there's virtually no pain for a dying patient that cannot be adequately controlled.
Wow.
Without the need to end their lives. Now, doing that in some cases can be really challenging, and requires a specialist to do that. And there are some places in the country that have lesser access to this than others.
Sure.
But I think the more we get access to this kind of first-rate pain control, the demand, I think, for assisted suicide is going to decrease. In fact, that's why the argument has changed from mercy to autonomy. And it's now sort of what your dad was talking about subjectivity, that the argument is that it's my life. If I want to off myself, that's nobody's business but my own. But for a follower of Christ, that really is God's business as well. Because the Bible's really clear that we are not our own. Our bodies don't ultimately belong to us. They belong to God. We've been bought with a price, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6. And therefore, we're to honor God with our bodies, I think particularly in the way we go home to meet him at the end of our lives. And we spend a lot of our times modeling how to live well. I think there's also a place for people who are in the last stages of life to model dying well. And to recognize that, that assisted suicide robs family members of ushering their loved ones right up to the doorstep of eternity. And we had this privilege with my dad. It was such a privilege to see him right before he died, to cross his arms and look up because he knew where he was going.
Wow. Just
as he took his last breath.
Wow.
And assisted suicide robs us of those sacred moments. So I think I'll give you an example. In the state of Oregon, that was the first state in the United States to legalize assisted suicide. They've had far fewer participants in this than they envisioned. And the reason for that is because palliative care, pain control, hospice care is so well established in the state of Oregon that the demand for assisted suicide has been far less than what they'd anticipated. Because what people want at the end of life is some semblance of control and for their pain to be controlled. And funny thing, surprise, surprise, when a person's pain is controlled, they actually want to live.
Wow.
They don't want to die. What they don't want is to die in unrelievable pain. And that's increasingly just simply not the case today in lots of places around the country.
So how concerned are you in the States? Because there's been some recent cases in Canada that have raised some red flags of concern. That the argument was made early on, what we're saying is voluntary will become involuntary. What was an immediate death sentence, you're going to die naturally within 6 months, will become not so much immediate. That you'll become a burden to those and other people will start making decisions. And if I'm not mistaken, soon in Canada, they are meeting to talk about euthanizing even kids and potentially babies, if I'm not mistaken. But it has moved that direction. Canada aside, do you have concern that the U.S. is going to head that direction? Or do you think there's certain defenses built in?
I have big concerns about that. And that's a slippery slope that we definitely don't want to go down. For example, in the Netherlands today, the age of eligibility for assisted suicide is 12. with the child himself or herself giving consent to that. That and the right to end a pregnancy, those are the only two medical procedures that a child can give consent for on their own without the parents being involved. Those are the only two things. And here's why that voluntary assistance or voluntary euthanasia will slide invariably toward non-voluntary euthanasia. The reason for that is because nobody has access to those private conversations between family members where we could sort of, gently but persistently twist our 95-year-old mother's arm that she needs to have assisted suicide done. Not because she's tired of living, but because we're tired of her living and being a burden on us. And because the state is tired of her living and being a financial burden. You may not be aware, but fully 50% of all the money you will spend on your health care occurs in the last 12 months of your life, statistically, when it does you the least amount of good. And I had a colleague, not a state university colleague, tell me, she said the reason assisted suicide will always be popular is because there's nothing cheaper than dead.
Wow.
So on that happy thought, but I think the reason is because nobody has access to those private conversations. And you and I could coerce our 95-year-old mother to do assisted suicide under compulsion, non-voluntarily, and nobody will ever know that we've coerced her into doing that. And so any law that says assisted suicide has to always be completely voluntary is also completely unenforceable. Because nobody, those are private conversations.
How do you prove that? Yeah.
You don't. You don't even know that it went on. That's a huge, huge problem.
What bioethics issues do you see coming in the future? And I ask because I think one of the things we've seen with the gender issue is this idea that I should not be limited by my body, whether it comes to the way I identify. And then I think, well, what's going to follow after that? You look at like artificial intelligence, and some of these issues is a desire to not be limited by the body in even further ways. Is that where biotechnology is headed?
I think in general, yes, but I think there's a more pressing issue that's with us right now today. And I told my philosophy students years ago that designer children will probably never be on the table in our lifetime. And I was wrong. Because 5 years ago, we figured out, like scientists at UC Berkeley, figured out how to essentially take scissors and paste to your genetic code, to where you can snip out a defective gene and replace it with a corrected one, literally with a genetic pair of scissors. And what that does is enables us to cure genetic disease once and for all. And it's a trait that's passed on to succeeding generations. What that also enables us to do is to select other traits that don't have anything to do with disease.
Wow.
And enable us to literally design our children in the laboratory today to have all sorts of specifications that we want, which I think undermines the notion of children being a gift from God that we receive open-handedly and without specifications. And that's, we already, it's been in practice for probably 10 years, 15 years now. We can choose the sex of our child fairly reliably. And people wonder, is that necessarily a good thing? I'm not so sure it is, because the places around the world where it's been widely practiced has been a disastrous demographic consequence, because you have way more boys than girls. And the gender imbalance is profound in some parts of the developing world that went whole speed ahead with this.
Which can contribute to things like sexual trafficking, et cetera, when there's a massive imbalance between men and women.
You would think if women were in short supply, their value would go up. But in reality, their value has been cheapened, and they become more victims of human trafficking than ever before in our history. Okay?
So,
My turn to put some
oh
questions
yeah,
to you.
okay. I thought you were just.
Okay? I was on a roll here, but
Let's do it.
but one of the things I've appreciated, Sean, about watching you work, not only with this podcast, but some of the other things that you do. You may not be aware, Sean has a YouTube channel that has over 100,000 subscribers to it, and it's just going like gangbusters. And he'll tell you in just a minute how you can get access to that. But hey, I can do that. I can shamelessly self-promote you. It's okay. But you do a lot with social media. I, on the other hand, am totally old school, and I do virtually nothing on social media. And my kids think I'm absolutely nuts for not doing anything on social media. How have you learned to use social media wisely and in a manner that exhibits sort of Christ-like humility and gentleness, which is definitely not the norm?
Well, let me just say, my social media use doesn't always reflect that. There's a lot of tweets I've had to delete. There's a couple videos I'm like, you know what, I'm going to take that down. So I'd honestly say a lot of that comes from trial and error, making mistakes, owning it, and realizing, you know what, I was hungry when I sent that tweet. I was angry when I sent that tweet, whatever it is. So if you're going to be on social media, you're going to make mistakes. The question is, are you going to own it, and are you going to move on? I just try to ask myself a few questions. What's the purpose of social media? What's the end goal for a Christian to use this tool? It's not just to get followers and subscribers. It's not to make money. I want to either encourage Christians in their faith or challenge non-Christians to consider the Christian faith. That's my goal. So I've thought through, what mediums do I use? Why do I use them? What's my goal? What's my lane? And then that helps to me weed out certain things that don't fit that lane. The other thing I often ask with social media is, how are things going to land? I mean, you and I did a whole show on this, but like when you look at how Christians comment on social media, it's the exception to find somebody who comments well and thoughtfully, because we're thinking about, I just want to win the argument. I want to prove this person wrong, rather than, how is this going to land? Is this honoring to the Lord? Is this a loving thing to post? Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I've always done that. I'm just telling you the principles that I try to do, because sometimes social media pulls out the worst in us. But I just look at it and I say, it's a tool to advance the gospel. It's a tool to minister to people. And I wrote a whole blog on how would Jesus comment on social media. And I really tried to think through, if he used social media, how would he comment? I think he'd tell stories. I think he'd ask a lot more questions than make statements. I think he wouldn't just gauge people by the amount of followers they had. He clearly didn't use that metric to value people, but would reach out to people who don't have a big following. That's just the way I look at this. So I would love Christians to think through, what does it mean to use social media in a Christian fashion that sets us apart from the audience? When I look at how a lot of Christians use social media, I mean, you and I, even on this podcast, if we wanted to just grow and have more followers, there's a way we could manipulate this, say shocking things, have on certain guests. But I feel like we would compromise our integrity before the Lord in doing so. And when it's all said and done, that's all I have, social media or not. It's my integrity, and I really don't want to compromise that.
So on your YouTube channel, just for example, what would you say are the most challenging apologetic questions that you've had to answer?
On my YouTube channel.
Because you have a very interesting following on that channel. You
I
get a lot
do
of
have
people
an
from a
interesting
lot of
following.
different, super interesting backgrounds.
So I think in general, the hardest question to answer anywhere are the problems of evil and suffering. And that manifests itself in different ways. And I think the reason it's so hard is it's not just an intellectual question, it's personal. We've experienced evil. We've experienced pain. We've suffered. And so how do you answer somebody intellectually but existentially? So that's probably the broad question. So conversations I've had, a lot of conversations about race. A lot at the heart of that is people have been mistreated, and they've been hurt, and they've suffered. Why would God allow this? Issues like LGBTQ, at the heart of a lot of LGBTQ is, why do I suffer? Did God make me this way? Am I going to love somebody and be loved back? These are versions of the problem of evil. So I think lurking behind most of the questions are the seeming absence of God, suffering in the world that is hard for people, Christians and non-Christians.
Yeah. I know on your channel you also had a conversation with a fairly well-known atheist, the writer for the New York Times.
Yeah.
Tell our group about that conversation.
Yeah, this was really fun. In fact, I just emailed him this week and asked him if he'd come back on and do a live Q&A. What's interesting about this is this fellow's name is Adam Davidson. He's written for The New Yorker. He's written for Slate Magazine, MSNBC, I think maybe The New York Times, done some really popular episodes on This American Life, and described himself to me, this was his terminology, an atheist New York media elite. That's how he described himself. This is an example. He actually reached out to me. Usually I'm reaching out, trying to get people to come on. He reached out to me and he said, hey, I've been following your channel for a while. I watch almost all of your stuff. And I thought, wow, you never know who's watching. If you're open to it, I'd love to have a conversation. Well, I played it off for a while because I thought, I just have a certain view of the media, right or wrong. I've been set up, I've been misquoted. Finally, I was like, I'm going to look into this guy's stuff, and thought, wow, he's not only super thoughtful, I think he's really sincere. So I asked him, I said, can I just bring on my channel and ask you about your life, spiritually, how you view Christians? He agreed, and I'll tell you one thing that stood out to me is I asked him, how many evangelical Christians do you know growing up? The answer was none. He said, Sean, 40% of the men that I knew were gay. 40%. So Christians were people depicted in the media. He's like, sometimes a Christian would try to give me a track, but Christians were the enemies. They were stealing our rights. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can at least understand if that's somebody's experience, why they would view us at Biola and the evangelical world through that lens. Great conversation. Then I followed up and I said, hey, you want to flip the script? Now you can just, what do you think about emailing me? Or not emailing me, about interviewing me. It was actually originally his idea. And he was just asking me questions about my family. At one point, he was so interesting. He's like, I don't understand the idea of God. Can you explain it to me? I was like, wow, what a fascinating thing. That one got over 100,000 views, which tells me people are hungry for conversations like that. When I started on YouTube, a few YouTubers who have bigger channels than I do, they're like, Sean, you try to be conversational and kind with people. It's not going to work on YouTube. You need to be controversial, got to be edgy. And I think I could create a bigger following. There's plenty of shocking things I could say and get a big following, but they're wrong. There's a lot of people who want thoughtful conversation. So he's coming back on soon. We're just going to do a live Q&A together. I think I'm going to call it an atheist journalist and a Christian professor, and I don't even know what people are going to ask. But it's cool. There's a lot of people willing to engage like that if we reach out.
And if we're gentle, kind, and caring about them.
I
care
think so.
Care about their lives as well as the arguments that they make back and forth.
And I'll tell you, it was super interesting. You can go listen to it and make up your own mind. But I think it was pretty clear that I would not be welcome in a lot of circles. In his kid's private school, wouldn't be okay to come and speak there. Yeah. He's like, we would like you as a friend, but professionally wouldn't really be welcome. Like, he just kind of owned that. And we're often told the right is closed-minded, not willing to engage. And he's like, it was just so interesting when we just step outside of our comfort zone, listen to people, ask them their experiences, find common ground. One of my favorite conversations, and I think we're going to have many more.
That's great. Too much fun you're having on that channel.
I am.
Hey, one last question. Where do you think the Think Biblically podcast is headed in the future? What are some of the things that you're looking forward to? What are we envisioning for future episodes? You should tell me, because I'd kind of like to know this myself.
Yeah, I don't know that we've talked this through, which is interesting, but so many people are looking for like that breakthrough video that goes viral, podcast that goes viral, YouTube video. And it was William Lane Craig, who's a research professor here, helped be a part of the MA Phil program that we had going back, huge influence in my life. He goes, I look at my life like the tortoise, just each day, plug away and try to advance the ball and be faithful. You look back over 5 years, 5 decades, and you've made a significant difference. So it's not like in the next 6 months there's these mega, incredible breakthrough things. I hope we're going to continue to up our game and improve and learn and grow. But I hope we're sitting here in 5 years and we go, you know what? We've had good content. We've been faithful to what God calls us to. We've innovated. And maybe if the numbers grow, who knows where it would be. When it's all said and done, numbers are cool. But when I look at that number, it's like 2.6 million. I'm like, wow. But when I get an email from a father who says, you know what, Sean, each week we listen to the Think Biblically podcast, my son and I, we get on the phone and we talk about it. That means more to me than 100,000 downloads of somebody I don't know. Yeah. It really does. So I just hope we keep learning and keep better and stay faithful to this as long as God allows us to do it. I'd be pleased.
Well, I got to tell you, the last 5 years have been such a treat for me just to work together with you. It's been such a joy to combine our gifts and our experience and our different fields into something that we think is going to last for a while. We're certainly hopeful that it will by the grace of God.
Well, I got to tell you, it was Scott's idea, not mine. So thanks for asking me to be a partner on this. I pinch myself every time we go in. And by the way, we go in and we'll record. It's about 6 now. When we first started, we were doing them every 45 minutes. We would stop, we'd be on, and we'd do 8 a day. And at the end of the day, we're looking at each other like spent. Like, why are we killing ourselves?
About halfway through.
What are we doing? Someone's 5 minutes late to the call. It messes up the whole day. Now we do on the hour about 6, maybe 7 at most a day. And now we've been filming them, which is cool, putting them online, just trying to reach a new audience. We have a Biola student. Shout out, Amaya, if you're out there. I know you're here tonight. Who's just helping us doing some creative stuff online. So I think we're, because we've had some success, gets more and more of the university's attention, starts growing, which I think is great and positive. But I just want to stay the course to what we're doing. I think we found something that works.
Well, if anything, I think the numbers tell us that. And grateful for our audience, here in person tonight, also live streaming. It's just been so fun to get a chance to do this with you over these last 5 years.
Amen to that.
Well, this has been an episode of Think Biblically, a podcast from Talbot School of Theology here at Biola University. If you've enjoyed the podcast, feel free to share it with a friend, encourage them to subscribe, and remember, think biblically about everything.
There's already some amazing questions that come in, and I chuckled during the end, sorry, because the first question says...
I thought you were laughing at me.
No, I'm sorry. I should not have responded that way. It says, how many T-shirts do you own, Sean? I have no idea. How many pairs of sneakers do you and your dad have combined, and where did you get them? I will tell the story.
Good. I think I wore a T-shirt tonight just in honor of Sean.
I appreciate that. 2 years ago, my high school son, who's a sneakerhead and has his own business, he goes, Dad, if a speaker walks on stage with Jordans, I would listen. And I said, tell me about that. Now, I'm not going to tell you how many pair I have, but he's talked me into buying more than I need. But I'll tell you, I wasn't planning on sharing this, but the pair of shoes I'm wearing tonight are, if you know Jordans, they're a pretty special pair. And they're not cheap. But my son walked up to me about 3 months ago, hands me a box, and says, this is for being a great dad. Opened it up, and it's the Spider-Man Jordan 1s. He tracked them down and paid for them himself. I'm not going to say what they're worth. You can pull it up and see. But it's amazing how much a connection from my dad to me and my son, 3 generations. Yeah. We just have fun. And do we overdo it? Probably.
Is this the first time you've worn them in public?
I've worn them a handful of times in public, but when I put them on, it's just, I think of what my son said, which
That's
is
great.
just pretty amazing. So
That's great.
all right. Here's another one. It says, John 12:47, Jesus said that he didn't come to judge the world. John 9:39 through 41. And then he said for judgment, he came into this world. Is this a contradiction? Well, I don't have the passage, then you can jump in here. I don't have the passage directly in front of me, and I'm not going to take the time to pull it up. But I think my bigger question would be, what does it mean that he came to judge? So judge can mean many different things. There's a sense where he judges, a sense where maybe he doesn't judge. And the context is going to reveal that. By the way, when it says the world, there's actually 3 different ways the world is taken. So sometimes it's to the systems and ideas of the world. Sometimes it refers specifically to people. So sometimes Scripture says we're of the world. Sometimes it says don't be stained by the world. Well, that's not a contradiction. You just have to look at the context. You have to look at the language and see what's being referred to. So without pulling these up, and I won't take the time to do that, I'm pretty sure within the Gospel of John, within 3 verses, John was smart enough to not directly contradict himself. Let's minimally give him that courtesy that he didn't intend that. So my guess is it's a different time in a different way.
I'd have to look at this a little more carefully to verify this, but my guess is that he was addressing 2 different audiences. He was very tough on the religious leaders who were in denial about their sin. He came to judge those who were in denial. But for those who were broken, who admitted their sin, who owned it, it was all grace and no judgment. So my guess is that those 2 different passages were addressing 2 slightly different audiences.
It's a pretty good guess, Ray. Good thinking, man. Love it.
I do that periodically.
Love it. Yeah, killing it. All right, here's a good one. It says, I find apologetic questions come up often in conversation with people who have been believers for 10, 20, 30 years, going through a season of doubt. How does discipline of apologetics, or the way you present the conversation, change when you're dealing with doubting believers instead of skeptics? Here's what I would say. If I'm talking with a doubting believer, I always want to know what's the question behind the question. What's the heart of the issue, why somebody's doubting? Now, sometimes it genuinely is intellectual. Many times it's not. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's relational. Sometimes it's moral. So if it's with a believer, I'm never going to say, oh, this question isn't serious. Tell me what you really think. I'm not going to ask it like that, but I'm going to prayerfully try to get to the heart of it and see if there's something deeper going on in that person's life. If they've been a believer 10, 20, 30 years and are going through a season of doubt, something deep is going on in their life. And many times there's a hurt and there's a pain that motivates it. So I just want to know what's the question beneath the question, what's the heart of the issue, and then let's deal with it. That's how I would approach with a believer who's doubting. Next. All right, good. Throughout the 5 years to Think Biblically, you both have asked great inquisitive questions of your guests and each other. How have you become better question askers, and are there any principles you would pass on to others? Now, that's a great question.
That is a great question.
I'd love to know what you think about that.
I think for ourselves, it's just been practice. We've had to learn to ask good questions, and I think we recognize that if a certain episode sort of falls flat, sometimes it's that the guest doesn't have a lot of energy, but most of the time it's because we're not asking good questions. And the questions we ask are too broad, which enables people to just sort of go on and on forever. But if our questions are sharp and specific and to the point, then people answer them sharply, specifically, and to the point. So I think we've just learned how to help our guests cut to the chase and get to the point and do it quickly. And I think we've had to own that there are times when we've just asked lousy questions, and we've had to get better at it.
And you know what else we should own? One of the things we do, you would know this, is because we're not being videotaped. Whenever somebody goes, wow, great question, we kind of look at each other like, yep, Gotcha.
That was mine.
Yep, that was me.
Yeah,
He
mine.
goes, he'll do this number sometimes. I'm like, okay, just having fun with it. The thing that I do is I watch other people who ask good questions. So podcasters, people in conversation, there's an art and science to become a good question asker. So I think people like Colin Cowherd on sports, when he does interviews, I'm like, that's a really thoughtful question. I think Megyn Kelly on news asks great, thoughtful questions, not even related to what we do, but good question askers. By the way, Paul asked 262 questions, and we have recorded Jesus asked 339. So just study the biblical questions. You'll learn a lot about that skill. So I hope in 5 years I'll be even better. All right, here's one. I think this is specifically for you. Is letting life take its course and not giving people all the medical help available to them the same as assisted suicide?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked. And the answer is no, it's not the same thing, because the main difference is that when disease takes its natural course through somebody saying stop to medicine, it's the disease or underlying condition that's the cause of death, not the intentional action of the person ingesting medication or the physician performing euthanasia. So the cause of death is really different, and the intention is different. The intention in saying stop to medicine is rarely that the person wants to die. What the person wants is to live out the rest of their days apart from burdensome medical interventions that are ruining their lives. I had a vivid experience of this, just really briefly, wheeling my father-in-law out of the hospital for the last time. He had surgery for a cancer, complications ensued, and he was left with a very weak voice, and I'm wheeling him out, and he motioned to me, he went to whisper, so he could whisper to me, and he said, "Don't ever bring me here again." And what he meant was, I'm done with medicine. I'm done with doctors because they've ruined my life. And I think what he really meant to say is, I will take from the hand of God the rest of my days as he sees fit. And I think when we make a decision under the right circumstances, because of course death is a conquered enemy, which means we don't always have to resist it. That under the right circumstances, we can say stop, and we are essentially turning that person back over to the Lord and trusting that loved one back to him for the rest of his or her days. And I want to be careful that we don't make a theological statement that we don't want to make. Because if we say that we're obligated to keep everybody alive at all costs, at all times, no matter what, we're saying, in effect, that earthly life is the highest good, which theologically we know that's not true.
Good answer.
Thanks. I've thought about that for a while.
I could tell. How have you approached the culture of the world with how quickly it's changed and changed drastically over the years? So I would say a couple things about this. I said, number one, the culture changes, but human nature does not. Never has changed, and it never will this side of heaven. So not only does human nature not change, but the scripture in Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun. So there's new nuances and particular things that change, but the heart core human issues don't change. So one of the ways I put it is I'll think about there's timely issues and there's timeless issues. There are timely issues that are pressing, like vaccines was especially timely. But then there's timeless issues that are even underlying vaccines, like justice and fairness and human value, autonomy, etc. So as culture shifts, human nature doesn't change. And even though there's timely issues, underneath them are timeless issues that will never change. That's how I briefly look at it. Here's one for you. Either of us, but I'd love to hear you. It says, how do you help people shift from subjectivism to objectivism? In the last 2 minutes. That's worth a whole discussion, but let me give it a shot. Okay. I think part of the ground that your dad was talking about, the cultural ground that
this stuff is made fertile in, is the view that we are morally obligated to live according to our desires, to be our authentic self, to live according to what our passions and what our desires are. And I think as I read the New Testament, I read the teaching of Jesus, which says that we're to deny ourselves, deny that we have ownership of ourselves, take up our cross and follow him. And I think on the list of things that are priorities in the life of Jesus, following his desires, I'm not sure was one of those. Because I know most of my field in ethics and moral philosophy is designed to prevent us from following our desires, to put boundaries around our desires. Because the Bible's really clear that our desires are a huge mixed bag. Yeah, we have some desires that are good and noble and need to be followed. We also have desires that are not quite so much. I heard a couple amens out there, and I concur. But I think if we followed our desires all of the time, we just see these sort of interpersonal and relational train wrecks that would take place repeatedly. And so I think that's if I were a youth pastor or high school or college pastor, that's I think the thing that I would try to get at. And that things are objectively true regardless of how we feel about them. And that what makes something subjective is, as you put it, it's true because we feel about it in a certain way.
I think that's good. So in other words, show that living this subjectivist approach leads to disaster. It's really unlivable, and some of the inconsistencies embedded within it.
Well, and I don't think anybody lives that way anyway.
I agree.
Just to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's well said. It is interesting on evidence that demands a verdict. When my father first wrote that book, there were no chapters on a defense of truth. When we update it recently, there's 3 chapters because people now used to say, that's not true, give me evidence. Now it's shifted to, is there such a thing as truth? Can we know it? Truth is oppressive. Yeah. That's how far back we've gone in the conversation.
No, that's not true. Who cares?
Yeah. But like you said, nobody lives that way when they're doing their checkbook or eating or even morally. We don't live in a relativistic culture anymore. We live in the culture that is quick to shame and call things like they should. Racism, sexism, wrong. So people know that, I think, pretty clearly.
A new moral absolutism
I think that's
is on the rise.
I think so.
Hey, thank you for your questions, and really good questions. It's been our pleasure to be with you all tonight. Thank you so much for coming and celebrating 5 years of the Think Biblically podcast with us. We have a reception outside for dessert and coffee and cider. So we'd love to have you join us for a few minutes outside. Wendy Ann, I don't know if I can't see you out there. Do you want to give some instructions about this? Okay.
Yeah, so
Thank you to you all.
Good job, man.